There's a page in my ledger from October of 1887 that has only 4 words on it. Sleet's old wagon hired her. I wrote that line the way a man writes a grocery list. Didn't underline it. Didn't put a mark beside it. I had no idea I was writing down the day my life turned over on its side, the way a horse turns over when it rolls in the dust and comes up a different color. She was 23. She couldn't say my name right for 4 months. She had a tin of caraway seed in her coat pocket and 11 cents, and a dead brother's name folded in a paper she never let anybody read. I offered her a job for the winter, cooking, mending, $8 a month in a room I hadn't opened in 6 years. I want to be honest with you before we start, because I'm too old now to be anything else. I didn't do it out of kindness. I did it because the house was quiet and the quiet had teeth. And what she gave me back, she'd tell you it was nothing. She'd tell you she only stayed because the snow came early. But I was there, I counted it. So sit down, and let me tell it while I still have all of it. The girl was standing in the sleet with her boots in a puddle, and she would not move. That's the first thing I ever saw of her. Not her face. Her boots, cracked across the toe, laced with what looked like a strip of harness leather, and planted in 2 inches of freezing brown water in front of the Sheridan Depot like she'd grown there. There was a crowd. Not a big one, 9, 10 people, the kind that gathers around anything with a raised voice in it, the way flies find a wound. The station agent was up on the platform where it was dry, holding a paper out at arm's length, and she was down in the water holding onto one handle of a trunk. A man in a good coat had the other handle. She wasn't yelling. That's what got me. Everybody else in that little knot was making noise, and she was just holding onto her end of that trunk with both hands and saying one word over and over low, like she was working it into the man's arm. Nye, nye, nye. I didn't know what it meant. I found out later. I'd come in that morning to sell a wagon I didn't need and buy salt I did. I was 49 years old that fall. I ran 220 head on the Tongue River, which is not many, and I'd run more once, which is a sentence I've since learned to stop saying out loud. I had a mule named Pilate who could open a gate latch with his lips, and I had a bad shoulder from a horse in '81, and I had a house. The house is the thing, keep the house in mind. Now I ought to explain about the ledger, because otherwise the rest of this makes no sense. Every night of my adult life I have written down the weather and one line of what happened. That's it. That's the whole of it. My father did it, and his book got burned in the war along with everything else he had, and when I was 19 I bought a green cloth ledger in Kansas City and started my own. Not a diary. I've never once in 50 years written down what I felt about anything. I write the temperature at dawn if I can guess it, and the wind, and one line. Clear cold, fix the east fence. Rain by noon, bay mare fold both fine. Snow nothing. There are whole seasons in that book that say nothing. 14 months in a row once, and I don't mean nothing happened. I mean I couldn't get my hand to write it. I'd sit at the table with the pen, and the weather would come out fine, wind SW, warm for Feb, and then the line for the day would sit there empty and I'd close the book. Anyway, that's my quirk, and I've been told it's a strange one. My wife used to say I'd write down my own funeral. Overcast. Buried Emmett. She thought that was the funniest thing she ever said. She said it maybe twice a year for 11 years and laughed at it every time like it was fresh. Her name was Ada. I'm going to say that name exactly 3 times in this story, and I'm telling you now so you'll notice. So the depot. I got close enough to hear the agent, who was a fat, decent, worn-out man named Fry, saying, "I cannot, miss. I have told you. The through fare was purchased in his name. It ain't transferable. It ain't, miss, if you'd let go of the trunk." And the man in the good coat said, "It's storage fees is what it is," to nobody, to the crowd, the way a man does when he wants witnesses to agree he's reasonable. 14 days at the freight house. Somebody's got to pay it. She had black hair coming loose from under a scarf, and a face gone gray-white with cold, and her chin was doing something I recognized. It was doing the thing a chin does when the rest of the face has decided it will not cry, and the chin didn't get the message. She was maybe as tall as my shoulder. She said in English carefully, like she'd built the sentence in another room and carried it out whole, "Is my brother trunk? Is not freight? Is my brother?" And Fry said, gently because he wasn't a bad man, "I know it, miss. Now here is where I'd like to tell you something noble. I'd like to tell you that I saw a young woman alone and friendless in a strange country, 3,000 miles from anything that knew her name, and that my heart moved in me like a good man's heart ought to. The truth is smaller and worse, and I've had 30 years to look at it. The truth is I looked at her hands on that trunk and I thought about my kitchen. I thought about the sound of one plate. I thought about how I'd taken to leaving the door open when I chopped wood so the house would have something in it besides the clock, and how 3 weeks before I had stood in the dark at 2 in the morning and said aloud, to the ceiling, to nobody, "I don't know what I'm doing this for." That's what moved, not my heart, something further down and less respectable. I said, "How much is the storage?" The man in the good coat turned around. $4.60. "Take it out of this." I gave him a 5. "The trunk goes with her." He looked at the bill and then at me and made a decision about what I was. I watched him make it. He handed me 40 cents and let go the handle and went off, and the trunk came down in the puddle so hard the water went over her boots, and she didn't so much as look at it. She looked at me. I have been looked at by a bad-tempered stallion, by a Sioux man in 1876 across about 80 feet of Powder River grass, and once by a judge. None of it was like this. She looked at me the way you look at weather coming, not scared exactly, estimating. "I have no money," she said. I cannot pay this back to you." "Didn't ask you to." "Everybody ask." She said it flat, not bitter, like reporting the price of flour. And I stood there in the sleet with my collar up, and Fry watching, and the crowd already coming apart because there was nothing more to see, and I heard myself say, "I've got a place on the tongue, 40 miles. I need somebody through the winter, cook, mend, feed stock. $8 the month in your own room. Come spring the road opens and I'll drive you to the cars myself and you can go wherever it is you're going." She didn't answer for a long time. Long enough that Fry went inside. Long enough that the sleet turned over into snow, the first of that year. Big soft flakes that came down through the sleet like something arriving late to its own party. Then she said, "Why?" Not "thank you." Not "how far is 40 miles?" Not "who else lives there?" which is the question she should have asked, which is the question I'd have asked, which I have thought about 10,000 times since. "Why?" And because I did not have an answer that would sound like anything but what it was, I said, "Because I've got a room nobody's using." She looked at me a while more. Then she bent down and got her end of that trunk out of the water, and she stood there holding it, waiting for me to pick up the other. Her name was Marysia Zawadzka. I'm going to spell it that way once, and then I'm going to write it the way I said it for the first year, which is Maryshaw, and she never corrected me. That's worth noting. She corrected me on 20 other things. She corrected my pronunciation of Wyoming once, and she was right. But she let me get her name a little bit wrong for a year and never said a word about it. I found out why eventually. It's not a nice reason, we'll get there. The wagon ride was 40 miles and took most of 2 days with a night at the Hollenbeck place. She sat with the trunk between her boots and her hands in her sleeves, and she asked me the name of everything we passed. Not conversation, vocabulary, she'd point. "Sagebrush," I'd say. "Sagebrush." Then she'd say it 4 or 5 more times under her breath, tasting it, the way you turn a stone over. "Antelope, well, pronghorn, some say." Which is true. Nobody had ever asked me that before. I said, "Pronghorn's true, antelope's what everybody says." She nodded like I'd told her something useful about the whole country, which maybe I had. She had a tin in her coat pocket, a little flat tin that had once held tooth powder, and about every hour she'd open it and take out one caraway seed and put it under her tongue. I watched her do it 4 times before I asked. For the she made a gesture at her middle. Sick, on the water, on the ship, my mother gives to me. Now is only for, she closed the tin, for remember. There were maybe 30 seeds in that tin. She was rationing them like a man rations tobacco in a hard winter, and she'd been rationing them for 2 years, and I did the arithmetic in my head and understood that at 1 seed an hour she was going to run out of her mother sometime around February. I didn't say anything about it. I've thought since that this was the correct thing to do and also a coward's choice, and that both those things can sit in the same saddle. That night at Hollenbeck's, she ate more than I've ever seen a woman eat, and she was ashamed of it, and she did it anyway. Mrs. Hollenbeck kept putting food down, and Marija kept eating it, and her ears went red, and her hand shook once on the fork, and she just switched hands and kept going. That's the first thing I ever saw her do that I'd call by its right name, which is endurance. And I want to be careful here, because everybody says the word like it means gritting your teeth. It doesn't. Enduring is not dramatic. Enduring is switching hands and continuing to eat. We came onto my place the second afternoon. It sits in a bend where the river shoulders around a bluff, and there's about 90 acres of bottom that stays green 3 weeks longer than anything around it. Log house, 2 rooms and a lean-to. Barn better built than the house, which tells you everything about the man who built it. Corrals. A cottonwood that lightning had taken the top out of in '84 and which went right on living, lopsided, for another 20 years. And I would like it noted that I never once made a metaphor out of that tree in front of her. And in the round corral, working a 3-year-old buckskin on a long line, was Soda. Marija went still beside me on the wagon seat. I'd been waiting for that. I'd been thinking about it for 40 miles and had not once thought of a way to say it, so what I said was, "That's Soda. He handles my horses. He's been here 5 years and he'll be here longer than I will, most likely, and he don't care to be talked to before noon." She watched him work. He didn't stop. That's his way. He didn't look up, didn't wave, didn't do any of the things a man does to acknowledge that a wagon has come into the yard. He kept the buckskin moving and his own body still, and the line in his hand had the same amount of slack in it the whole time, not a hand's width more or less, which is a thing I have never in my life been able to do. I said he's Chiricahua, Apache. And I braced for it. I'd seen it before. I'd had 2 hired men quit inside a week. I'd had a woman from the church at Big Horn ask me, with real concern, real Christian concern in her voice, whether I slept easy. I'd had Harlan Voss, my nearest neighbor, 4 miles east, tell me across a fence in 1885 that there was a bounty once and there'd be a bounty again, and he'd hate to see me lose good property. I knew what came next, so I braced. Marija said, "He is good with the horse." That's all. Then, after a minute watching, "The horse is not afraid. Look, he is thinking he wants to do it." I have known men who worked stock their whole lives who couldn't have told you that in 100 words. She got down off the wagon and she went and stood at the corral rail, not close. She had sense. And she watched him bring that buckskin around, and Soda finally looked over at her. He said something to the horse. Then he said to her, "Zawadzka." She jumped like she'd been struck. Because I hadn't told him her name. I hadn't sent word ahead. There wasn't any way on God's green earth for that man to know that name. He tipped his chin at the trunk in the wagon bed. There were letters painted on the end of it, half worn off, and they said Zawadzki, which is what her brother's name was, because that's how it works in that language, the men one way, the women another, and I didn't learn that for 2 more months. He'd read the trunk, that's all. She looked at that trunk and she looked at him, and something went across her face that I can only describe as relief, and I did not understand it then. It took me until the following March to understand it. She had been in this country 26 months, and she had gotten used to being looked at as a thing without a name, and a stranger had read her family off the end of a box, out loud, correctly, in a corral in Wyoming. Dasoda went back to the horse. She said quietly to me, "How do I say it, his name?" Dasoda. No, how do I say it? And she said it back to me twice, and the second time it was closer to right than mine had been in 5 years, because she had ears trained by being wrong in 3 languages, and I stood there in my own yard and got taught something by a girl I'd hired 48 hours before. The room. I have to do the room now. I'd carried the trunk to the door of the back room and set it down, and then I stood there with my hand on the latch for what she later told me was near a full minute. The Linta has one window. It was my son's room. I had not opened the door in 6 years, and I had told myself all 40 miles that this was simple, that a room is boards and air, that there was nothing in there but dust and a bed. There was a pair of boots under the bed. Boys' boots. Size 4, heels worn crooked on the outside because he walked like his mother. His name was Tom. That's the second name. I opened the door and the cold came out at us. That dead still cold that a shut room makes. And she stepped past me into it, and I watched her look at the boots and at the shelf where there was a jar of hawk feathers and a fossil and a wooden horse I'd carved so badly it looked like a dog. She looked at all of it for about 4 seconds. Then she turned around and she said, "I will keep this clean." And she began, right then in her coat, to untie her scarf and roll it up to use as a rag. She never asked, not that day, not that month. I want you to understand what that was. It wasn't in curiosity. She was the most curious person I ever met. She asked me the name of every damn plant on that river. It was manners. It was the manners of somebody who has herself been asked a question she couldn't answer without bleeding. And I stood in that doorway and something in my chest came apart very quietly. The way ice goes on a pond, no sound, just a change in the color. That night, the ledger says, "Snow 3 in, girl come, cleaned out the lean-to." Look at that, cleaned out the lean-to, like she'd swept a shed. I read that line now and I want to reach back through 30 years and take the pen out of my own hand. Winter set in the second week of November, and it set in mean. I'll tell you how the days went, because the days are the story, and everybody wants the story to be the blizzard and the birth and the man with the gun, and it isn't. It's the days. She got up before me. I never once beat her to that stove. She'd have it going and coffee on, and she'd be standing at the window with her hands around the cup, looking at the light come up over the bluff, and she'd say the words for what she saw. Frost, willow, magpie, ice, no, skin of ice. She'd made herself a wall. She took a piece of charcoal and on the plank wall by the stove, at about shoulder height, she began writing English words. Not a list. Scattered wherever there was room. Words she was fighting with. Enough. Through. Cough. Dough. Those 4 in a row, and beside them in a hand that had gotten quite angry she'd written, WHY. I laughed out loud when I saw that. First time in the house in, I don't know. She heard me from the yard and came in to find out what was wrong and found me standing there with my hand over my mouth like a fool, and she looked at the wall and then at me and she said, "It is not funny. It is crazy. Your language is crazy." And then she started laughing too, and we stood in that kitchen laughing at the word cough like 2 idiots. And Dasoda came in for his dinner and looked at the both of us and turned around and went back out. The chickens knew her inside a week. She talked to them in Polish. Long sentences. She said she could only tell the truth in Polish now, and the chickens were the only ones who'd listen. And I said, "What truth?" And she said, "That I am tired," in English plainly, and went out with the pail. She could mend anything. She rebuilt my winter coat from the inside, took it apart and put it back together with a second layer cut out of a wool blanket that had been in Tom's room, and she asked me first, and I said yes, and I wore that blanket over my ribs for 11 winters. She was afraid of the river, never told me why. She'd flinch, and this is the thing I noticed in December and put away and did not look at. She'd flinch if a hand came up too fast near her. Not a big flinch. Her eyes would go and her weight would shift back a half-inch and it'd be gone. I reached past her for a lamp once, and she was against the wall before I got there, and neither of us said one word about it. And I went out to the barn and stood in the dark with my hand on Pilate's neck for a while. And there was a scar, right side of her jaw up under the ear about 2 inches, silver white and thin. Old, healed badly the way a thing heals when nobody sews it. I never asked. I've told you why. It's the same reason she didn't ask about the boots. Now DeSoto. He is the reason I can tell this story at all, and he'd hate that I'm saying so, and he's been dead 19 years, so he'll have to live with it. DeSoto came north in 1882 on a horse contract with a man named Crane, and Crane died owing him money. And instead of going back, he came up the tongue and stopped at my corral and looked at a horse I'd been fighting for 6 weeks. Didn't ask for the job. Just stood at the rail looking at the horse with an expression of such profound, weary disgust at me, at my methods, at the whole white race's approach to the animal that I said, "Well, hell then, you do it." And he did, and he was still there 5 years later. He was somewhere past 50. He had 4 fingers on his left hand and a way of standing that took up no room at all. He'd been at San Carlos. He said the word San Carlos to me exactly once in 5 years, and then he said, "I am not going to talk about that." And I said, "All right," and we didn't. He called me Rourke. Everybody in the county called him Does, which he hated, and which I did too once in my first year, and he turned around and said, "DeSoto," and I said it back. And that was the whole conversation and the whole lesson. Here's how he and Marija got on. 3rd week she was there, she went out at dawn and found him doctoring a mare's hoof, and she stopped about 15 feet off and stood, and he ignored her for maybe 10 minutes, and then he said, without looking up, "You want something?" And she said, "I want to know how you know when it is done." He looked up. She said, "The horse. You stop before I think you will stop. Every time, how do you know?" DeSoto set the hoof down. He said, "Because I want him to want to come back tomorrow." And she stood there in the cold turning that over, and I was watching from the barn door with a bucket in each hand like a damn fool, and I remember thinking, she's going to be all right then. Not because he'd been kind. He hadn't been especially kind, but because she'd asked the right question of the right man, and this is a thing that almost never happens to anybody anywhere, and when it does you can feel the weather change. After that he taught her, not lessons. He'd say, "Watch the ears," and go about his business. He gave her a horse to be responsible for, a plain, sensible brown mare called Peg, and Marija, who had never sat a horse in her life, who was from a town with a bell tower and a market square and a river you could throw a rock across, learned to ride that winter in 3 feet of snow because DeSoto told her, once, "If you are going to be here, be here." She fell off. A lot. There's a ledger entry in December that says clear hard freeze. M off the mare 4x, got back up 4x, said a word I did not understand. 4 times. I counted because that's what I do, I count things and write them down. Now Harlan Voss. Voss came over the 2nd week of December on a claim about a heifer of mine in his hay, which was true, and about a stretch of fence, which was also true, and neither of those things was why he came. He came to look at the girl. Word had gone around the way it does. Rourke's got a Polak girl out there with him, and that Indian and nobody else for 40 miles. He sat his horse in my yard, and he said the fence, and he said the heifer, and then he said, "You want to be careful, Emmett." About my fence. About how it looks. He was a big florid man with pale eyes, and he wasn't stupid, which was the worst of it. Man alone, girl alone, and a buck in the barn. I want to tell you I hit him. I didn't hit him. I was 49 years old and I needed his water gap in the spring, and I said, "The fence I'll see to Thursday." And he sat there a while longer and then he said, "You know they can't be held to anything, legally, if something was to happen to her." Marija was in the doorway. She'd come out with an armload of wood and she was standing in the doorway of my house, and she'd heard all of it, or enough of it, and I saw her understand it, and I saw the thing that came up in her face. It was not fear. She came down the step and past my horse, and she went right on past Vas, close enough to touch his stirrup, and she carried that wood over to where Dasoda was splitting kindling by the barn, and she set it down, and she said something to Dasoda, and Dasoda looked up at Vas for 1 second, and then went back to the wood. Vas went home. That night I sat with the ledger and wrote cold, wind in, and then I sat there with the pen for a long time, and finally I wrote, "Vas come by," ashamed of myself. That's the only time in 53 years I've written a feeling in that book. It's still there. The ink went brown. Christmas she made pierogi out of nothing: flour, a potato, an onion, a scrape of the last cheese, and she cried while she was doing it, working the dough and crying steadily and silently and not stopping the work for a second. And when I came in she didn't turn around and she said, "Do not," in a voice like a hand held up. So I went and sat down and let her be, and after a while she brought the plate over. She sat down across from me. Dasoda came in, because she'd made him come in for that one, and he sat with us, and the three of us ate her mother's food in a log house in Wyoming in the dark at 4 in the afternoon in December. She said, "In Poland this is Christmas Eve. We put hay under the cloth." She touched the bare table. "For the, I do not know the word, because he was born in the where the animals are." "Manger," I said. "Stable." "Stable," she nodded. She looked at Dasoda. "You have a word for this, for a thing you do because your mother did it." Dasoda ate for a while. Then he said, "We do not do them any more, so there is no word for it now." And she reached across and put her hand flat on the table next to his plate, not touching him, just there, and left it there. And nobody said anything else for a long time, and outside the wind came around the corner of the house and found the loose shingle it always found. That's the closest thing to a Christmas I've had since. The letter came in January. I'd gone into Bernie for salt and mail, and there were 3 things: a bill, a paper, and an envelope addressed to Miss M. Zawadzka, care of E. Rourke, Tongue River. Postmarked Butte, Montana. I want to be very exact about what happened when I handed it to her, because I have gone over it so many times that I no longer entirely trust myself, and a man ought to say so. She was at the stove. She turned around, wiping her hands. She took the envelope and she looked at the writing on the front of it, and her face did nothing at all. Nothing, that's what frightened me. If she'd gone white, if she'd gasped, I've seen people get bad news. This wasn't that. Her face went smooth, the way a lake goes smooth, and she turned around and opened the stove door with the poker and put the letter in it and shut the door. Unopened. Then she went back to the potatoes. I said, "Marija." She said, "Do you want the onion in this or no?" "Marija." She put the knife down. She kept her back to me, and she said in a low, even, careful voice, out of that other room where she built her English sentences, "You gave me a job for the winter. You did not buy the rest." And she was right. God help me, she was right, and I stood in my own kitchen and took it, and after a while I said, "There's more mail if you want it, or I can tell 'em there's nobody here by that name." Her shoulders came down about a half-inch. She said, "Yes, please, that." She never turned around. I went out to the barn. Dasoda was there, and he looked at my face and said, "Somebody wrote to her." I said, "How do you know these things?" He said, "Because you came in here to stand where nothing is happening," and went on cleaning tack. February I got the pleurisy, or something like it, and was down 11 days. I remember about 4 of them. I remember her hand on my head and the sound of her arguing with Dasoda in the other room in a language that was neither of theirs, which is to say English, both of them wrestling it. About whether to send for a doctor 40 miles in a blizzard. I remember she won. I remember she made a poultice that smelled like the devil's own armpit, and she put it on my chest every 4 hours for 11 days and slept in the chair. I remember waking up once in the night and the lamp was low, and she was sitting there with her legs pulled up, sound asleep, holding the little tooth powder tin in her fist. And I remember on maybe the 9th day, when I was clear enough to talk and stupid enough to do it, I said out loud, "Ada used to make me stay in bed." And she said, "Who is Ada?" Third time, that's 3. I told you to notice. I lay there and looked at the boards over my head, and it had been 6 years, and I had not said either of those names out loud to a living person. And here was this girl who had walked into my house out of a puddle of sleet, and she was too tired to know she'd asked me something enormous. I said, "My wife." She waited. I said, "And there was a boy, Tom, he was 9. I said, "It was the diphtheria. It went through here in 81. It took him on a Tuesday and it took her the Saturday after, and I want you to know it was the same week the grass came in, and everything in this valley was the greenest I ever saw it." Long quiet. Then she said, "That is why you did not open the room." "Yes." "And why you hire me." I said, "Yes." And she said, "And I have never forgotten this, and I have never once been able to decide whether it was the kindest or the cruelest thing anybody has ever said to me. Good, it is better to be used for something." Then she got up and put another stick in the stove. Now here is where I've got to slow down, because from here it goes fast, and I've been 30 years getting used to how fast. The last week of February the weather broke false, that treacherous warm that comes and lies to you. Snow went to slush. The river talked in the night. I was up walking again, thin as a rail, and Dasoda had 11 cows in the bottom he didn't like the look of. It was a Thursday. Marija had been strange for 2 weeks. Not sad. Slow in the mornings. She'd stopped drinking her coffee, and I'd caught her once with her hand flat on the wall by the stove, breathing careful, and she'd smiled at me sideways and said, "The bread makes me tired," which is not a thing bread does. And the seed tin had been empty since the 8th of the month. I knew because I'd seen her open it and look in it and close it and put it back in her pocket. Thursday morning, she went out to the chickens. I was at the table with the ledger, writing the weather, warm, 40s, snow going, wind slack, and I heard the pail go over. That's all, a tin pail hitting frozen mud. I got out that door faster than a man 11 days off his sickbed has any right to. And she was on her knees in the chicken yard with her hands in the muck and her head down and the birds walking around her. And I got hold of her under the arms, and she came up with her eyes rolled back white, and she said something in Polish, 3 words, and went down again. I carried her in. She weighed nothing. She weighed nothing, and I remember thinking with a kind of horror, she has been eating less than me since I got sick. Dasoda came in from the barn. He took one look at her on the bed, and his face changed Dasoda's face, which never changed, and he stopped in the doorway. I said, I don't know, get water, something." And Dasoda said quietly, "Rurk." I said, "What?" He said, "Look at her." And I did. She had one hand over her stomach, not a woman clutching her belly in pain, the other thing. The flat, spread, unmistakable, unconscious thing. Both of us stood there, and the clock ticked, and outside the fall spring dripped off the eaves, and Dasoda said, so gently I could have hit him for it. "Since before the snow, I think." Marija opened her eyes. She looked at me and at Dasoda and at where her own hand was lying, and she saw that we had seen, and she took her hand away too late, and then she stopped pretending all at once, the way a rope parts. 23 years old, in a dead boy's room, 3,000 miles from her mother with an empty tin in her coat. She said one word in Polish, and I did not know it, and I did not need to. Then she said, in English, in a voice I had not heard from her before and would hear only once more in my life. Do not send the letter back to him, please. Do not tell him where I am. And behind me, through the open door, the wind came around out of the north and slammed it, and the temperature that afternoon fell 51 degrees in 6 hours, and that was the 26th of February, 1888, which anybody who lived on this river then can tell you the name of. I did not write in the ledger that night. There's just the date and the weather, and then nothing at all until March the 9th. 3 words doing the work of 11 days, and I'm going to have to unpack them for you, because all alive was not a certainty on any of those 11 days, and on one of them it was closer to a lie than I like to think about. The storm came in on the 26th of February, like a door closing. I've heard men describe it since. They say the wall of it. They say you could see it coming across the flat like a hand. What I remember is the sound the house made, not the wind. The house, the logs groaning in their notches like a thing being asked to hold more than it agreed to. We had Marija on the bed by the stove. She was awake by then and furious about it. Furious at the fainting. Furious at being carried. She tried twice to get up and make supper, and I'd put her back down with 2 fingers on her shoulder, which is all it took, which was the thing that scared me worst of all. And that soda was out. He'd gone for the 11 cows in the bottom before it hit, because he could smell it and I couldn't, and he'd said, "An hour," and gone. And then the light went the color of a nickel, and the temperature dropped so fast the wet mud in the yard went hard and stayed hard, and the snow came in sideways and stopped being snow and became a thing with grain in it, like sand, like it had been ground up somewhere in the sky. An hour went by, then 2. I got as far as the barn twice. I want you to understand. The barn is 61 paces from my kitchen door. I know because I've counted, and I count things. It's what I do instead of feeling them. 61 paces. Twice I got there hand over hand along the wire I'd strung in '83 for exactly this, and twice I stood in the black with the horses stamping and screaming, and I got out to the corner of the corral and put my face into it and could not breathe. You can't breathe. That's what nobody tells you. The air had a shape and the shape was no. The second time I came back and I was crying, and I didn't know it until she said, "Your face," and reached up and touched the ice on my cheek where it had frozen. I said, "I can't get past the corral." She said, "How far is the where the cows are?" "Mile and a quarter." She looked at the door. I said, "Don't." And she said, 23 years old, 5 months gone, flat on a bed in a dead child's blanket, she said, "He does not have a rope." Because he didn't. He'd gone for cows on a warm afternoon in February. He had a coat and a horse and 40 years of knowing better, and knowing better does not weigh anything against that wind. We sat up all night with the lamp in the window, which is idiot's work, and I did it anyway because the alternative was to sit in the dark and know. She didn't sleep. Somewhere around 3 she started talking. Polish mostly, long, low, running, the way she talked to the chickens, and once she stopped and said to me in English, "I am telling him the road." I said, "He can't hear you." She said, "I know it," and went on. He came in at 11 the next morning. He came in on the wire. He'd found the drift fence out of the bottom by walking into it, and followed it 1.25 miles with his hands. And where the drift fence ends there is 40 feet of nothing before my corral wire starts, and he crossed those 40 feet by lying down flat and going by the ground, because the ground was the only thing left in the world with a direction on it. He lost the horse. He didn't lose the horse. He turned her loose at the fence, which was right, which is what saved her, and she came up out of the willows on the 3rd day with ice in her mane and the skin off her nose. He'd taken his mittens off to hold the wire. That's the arithmetic. You can't grip in mittens. He needed his hands, and so he took his hands out and gave them to the storm, 1.25 miles, And when he came through my kitchen door, he was gray and he was walking, and his hands were not hands anymore. They were two objects. He said, "The cows are in the willow bend. They will live or they will not." And then he sat down on my floor. Marija got up off that bed. I don't know how. She was on her feet before I was, and she had the snow off him, and she would not let me put his hands in warm water. I had the kettle. I was going to, and she got in front of me and said "Nigh" in that voice, and I stopped like a mule stops. Snow. She packed them in snow. Then cool water, and then a little warmer, and it took the whole afternoon, and Dasoda sat on my kitchen floor with his back against the woodbox and made no sound at all while a girl who could barely stand brought his hands back 1 degree at a time. I know now that she was right, and I'd have crippled him. She'd seen it before. She said later, in the mountains at home, the men who go for wood. He kept his fingers, all 4 on the left, all 5 on the right. The nails came off in April and grew back wrong and thick like horn, and for the rest of his life he could not feel cold water, which he said was the best trade he ever made in his life, and which was a joke, and which I did not laugh at for about 6 years. Around dark, when it was done, he looked at his own hands in his lap for a while. Then he said to her, "Sit down, you are white." And she sat down. And Dasoda said into the fire in the flattest voice you ever heard, "At San Carlos there were women who had children in the winter. Some of them lived. The ones who lay down lived. The ones who worked did not." That is the entire amount he ever told me about San Carlos, and he did not tell it to me. He told it to her, and he told it so she would lie down. She lay down. 11 days snowed in. The 8th day is the one I don't talk about, and I'm not going to talk about it now either, except to say that there was blood, and it stopped, and Dasoda went out into a whiteout with his ruined hands to get snow to melt because the water was gone, and Marija lay on that bed with her jaw set and her eyes on the ceiling and did not make one sound for 2 hours, and at some point in there I found myself on my knees by the bed, which is not a thing I do. And she took her hand off the blanket and put it on the back of my head. She was comforting me. I have not gotten over that. I don't expect to. And then it stopped, and by evening she was asking for food, and the thing inside her was still there and stayed there. And on the morning of the 9th day, I found her at the window with her hands around a cup, looking at 90 acres of white, saying, quietly to nobody, "Frost willow magpie." Nomming it again, building the wall back. March the 17th, I wrote to a seed house in Nebraska. I put it in with the cattle order, and I felt like a fool doing it, and I did not mention it to a living soul. I wrote, "Also send caraway seed, 1 lb if you have got it. If you have not got it, write and tell me who has." It cost 40 cents and 11 weeks. I'm getting ahead, that's later. Now the man from Butte. April the 4th, and the road had opened maybe 6 days, and Harlan Voss came up my lane with a second rider behind him. I was in the corral. Dasoda was in the barn and stayed in the barn, which was not cowardice, which was the single most sensible thing anybody did that day, and which I understood at the time and have understood better every year since. The man behind Voss got down off a good horse. He was maybe 35. Black hair, clean shave, a suit of clothes that had been expensive in Butte and was now dusty, and a way of standing with his weight even on both feet that a man learns in a place where somebody might come at him. He was handsome, I have to say that. I've wanted for 30 years to say he was some kind of gargoyle, and he wasn't. He was a good-looking man with a soft voice. He said, "Mr. Rourke, my name is Kazimierz Nowak." And Voss from the saddle, with his face full of the pleasure of it, "This gentleman's come a long way, Emmett." Nowak said, "I am looking for my wife." Marija came out onto the step. She'd heard the horses. She had flour on her hands, and she was 6 months along, and there was nothing to hide any more, and she stood in the doorway of my house and looked down at that man in the yard. And he said gently, and this is the part I want you to hear. He said her name. He said it correctly. Every consonant in the right place, the whole shape of it, the way it was said in the town with the bell tower, and it went through her like a bullet goes through a board. She put her hand on the doorframe. She had never once in 5 months flinched at Mary Shaw. She flinched at that. And in 1 second, I understood a thing I had been too stupid to see all winter, which is that she had let me say her name wrong on purpose, because a wrong name is a name that nobody who ever hurt you knows. That's why. That's the whole reason. She'd let me carry a broken version of her around for 5 months because it was safe, and I had thought it was manners. Noek said, Marija, I have come to take you home. She said, I am not your wife. He turned to me patiently like a man explaining a fence line. Her brother Jan died in the Anaconda mine 19 months ago. He owed the passage on the both of them, hers and his, $62 and some. I paid it. I kept her, I fed her, I gave her work. There is a paper. There is no paper, she said. There is a paper for the debt. Yes, she said, there is a paper for the debt. And she looked at him and said, show him the paper for the wife. Voss shifted in his saddle. Noek smiled. He had a smile like a lamp being turned down. He said in Polish 4 or 5 words low, and I did not understand one syllable of it, and Marija went the color of the flower on her hands. I said, say it in English. He said, it is between us. I said, nothing on this place is between you and her. And now here it is, the thing I have to tell straight. I had a rifle inside the door, 8 feet from where she was standing. I had, in a coffee tin on the shelf over the stove, $140 from the fall cattle, which was every cent I had in the world and which I had already, in the 4 minutes since he got off that horse, decided to give him. $62 and some. I'd have paid $200. I'd have paid the place. I started for the door. And she said, Emmett. She had never in her life used my given name. Not once. It stopped me the way a hand on the chest stops you. She came down off the step and she stood in the mud in front of that man in the good boots, and she said to me, without turning around, if you pay him, then I was a thing that could be bought, and then I am bought twice, and the second time I will have to live in the house of the man who bought me. I said, that ain't. I know what it is not, she said. I know it in here. She touched her own head hard twice with 2 fingers. I know it in here, but I will not know it here. And she put her hand flat on her chest, over her heart, over the flower, and left it there. And I stood in my own yard, 49 years old, with a rifle 8 feet away, and $140 on the shelf, and every single thing in me screaming to use one or the other. And I did nothing. That was the choice. People always want the hard choice to be a thing you do. Mine was a thing I didn't do, and it took everything I had, and it is the closest I have ever come to being a decent man. She talked to Noak for 6 minutes. In Polish. I don't know what she said. She said it quietly, and she did not raise her voice, and once she pointed at the scar under her ear and left her finger there for a long moment. Whatever it was, he stopped smiling. At the end of it, he said something, and she said one word, the word from the depot, nigh, and he stood there in my yard in his ruined boots, and something went out of him, some current he'd been running on, and he looked around at the barn and the lopsided cottonwood and the log house like a man who has just seen the price of a thing and finds it higher than he thought. He said to me in English, she was ill on the boat, I gave her seeds for it. And he got on his horse. Voss said, now hold on. And Noak said, shut up, in a voice that I would not want aimed at me, and rode out of my yard, and I never saw him again. And in 1893 I read his name in a Butte paper in a list of men killed underground, and I sat with that paper for a long time and could not find one clean thing in myself about it. Voss went home too. He told it in Bernie for years, Rurk, and the Polak girl and the Indian. He told it his way. I never bothered about it. I'd found out that April what my own courage was actually made of, and it turned out to be mostly standing still, and after that a man's opinion in a store didn't weigh much. She was sick that night, not from the child. She sat on the step in the dark and shook, hard, the way a dog shakes, and I brought her a blanket and did not touch her and did not talk. And after about an hour she said, "He gave me the seeds." I said, "I know, I heard. On the ship. My mother is dead in Krakow, my brother is sick, and this man from the same country comes to us and is kind, and he gives me a tin of caraway for my stomach." She laughed. It was an awful sound, and I have eaten them for 2 years like they are her hands. She looked at the empty tin in her lap. She'd carried it out with her. She said, "I do not know what is mine anymore. What is a kindness and what is a rope?" And then she said the thing that I have thought about more than anything else any person has ever said to me. "You do not say my name right, do you know that?" "I know it. Why do you not ask me?" I said, "Because you never asked me about the boots." She sat there in the dark with the blanket around her shoulders and the empty tin in her hands, and she started to cry, finally, 5 months late, and she cried like somebody who has forgotten how and is being made to remember, and she let me sit there while she did it, which is the only thing I had to give. Around midnight she said, "Mara Shah." I said it back. She said no. I said it again. She said no, and by then she was laughing, wrecked and hiccuping and laughing, and she made me say it 11 times, and I got it right on the 9th and 10th and wrong again on the 11th, and she said, "Good, keep it a little wrong. I am used to it." The seed came the 2nd week of June. 1 pound of caraway in a paper sack, from Nebraska, 40 cents. I planted it before dawn on a Sunday in the corner of the garden by the fence where the water stands, because I did not want to be seen doing it, and it came up thin and I thought I'd killed it, and then it came on thick, and it flowered white and it smelled like nothing on that river had ever smelled. She found it on the 11th of June. I was in the barn. I heard her come out with the chicken pail and I heard the pail go down, carefully this time, not dropped, and I looked out and she was standing in the corner of the garden with both hands over her mouth. She didn't say anything to me about it. Not that day, not ever, not once in 29 years. She just started putting caraway in the bread. The girl was born on the 2nd of July, 1888, at about 4 in the morning, and it took 19 hours, and I have never been so useless in my life. DeSoto ran it. DeSoto, who had told me once that he did not know anything about bobbies, boiled the water and kept the fire and cut the cord with a knife he'd held in the flame. And when it went bad in the last hour and I was standing there like a post, he said to me, "Rourke, talk to her. She cannot see you. Talk." And I got down by the bed and I talked, and God knows what I said. I have no idea what I said. I think I named things. I think I named every plant on that river. 19 hours. She never screamed. She made a sound in the last of it that I can only compare to a hinge, low, and she pulled on DeSoto's forearms with those thick horn nails of his digging into the blanket, and she said something over and over in Polish, and it was not a prayer. I found out years later it was, "I am here, I am here, I am here." The child came out gray and did not cry. I want to be exact about how long. DeSoto turned her over on his ruined hand, face down along his arm, and he thumped her back once, twice, and I counted, because that is what I do, and it was 14 seconds. 14 seconds is a season. 14 seconds is a war. And then she coughed, and the sound she made was not much. A kitten, a hinge, and Marija said, "Oh," in English, of all things in English, and started to shake all over. And DeSoto put that child on her chest with his 4 fingers and turned around and walked out of my house into the dark. And I found him at dawn sitting on the corral rail with his back to me, and he did not turn around, and I let him be. She named her nothing for 11 days. That's not so strange in that country in that year. Half the children born on the tongue got called sister and baby until somebody wrote it in a book. But it wasn't that. She would not name her, and she would hold her for hours, and she would look at the wall. On the 11th day, I came in at noon, and she was sitting up with the child asleep on her, and my green cloth ledger was open on the bed beside her. She had gone through it. Now, I want to tell you that I was angry. I stood in that doorway and looked at 50 years of my handwriting in a girl's lap, and I felt something go up the back of my neck. She looked at me and did not apologize and did not close the book. She said, "There are so many days that say nothing." I said, "There were a lot of days like that." She turned back a few pages with one hand. She said, "Here you write, ashamed of myself." I said, "Marija." And she said, "Here." And she turned to the front of the book, to the first pages, to 1857, to a 19-year-old boy in Kansas City with a new ledger and nothing to put in it. And she pointed to a line I hadn't looked at in 3 decades. It said, "Rain bought this book, do not know what for." She said, "I know what for." And she picked up the pen off the shelf, my pen, the one I'd had since the war, and she dipped it. And she wrote in that careful, laborious, wrestled with English hand on the page for July the 13th, under my own weather note. Warm wind slack. Today Ada Zawadzka is 11 days old, and her mother is not alone. And she held the pen out to me, handle first. I did not take it for a long time. I have never in my life been able to explain what happened in my chest in that minute, and I am not going to try now. She said, "You are angry." I said, "No." She said, "You are something." I said, "Yes." She said, "I did not ask you about the name, because you did not ask me about the boots." And then, quietly, in the flat voice she used for the truth, "But she has to be called something, and I have been in this house 8 months, and I have heard you say that name one time in the fever, and I want to say it out loud in a kitchen. I want it to be a name that is not," she looked for it, "not only in a hole in the ground." I took the pen. I sat down on the floor by that bed with my back against it, which put me lower than her, which is where I ought to have been, and I could not write anything at all. After a while she put her hand on the back of my head, the way she had on the 8th day of the storm. And the child made a noise, and Marija said in Polish, something soft, and then in English, translating for me, because she always translated for me. She says she is here. That's the gift. People hear this story and they think it's the child, and it's not, or it's not only that. Anybody can be handed a baby. I've been handed Bobbies. The gift is that a 23-year-old girl with 11 cents and a scar under her ear went into a stranger's private book, the one place where he had written nothing 14 months in a row, and she did not weep over him, and she did not pity him, and she did not tell him it would be all right. She wrote a line in it, and then she gave him the pen. She stayed. Not because of me. Let's have that straight. She stayed because the road opened in April, and by then she was too far along to travel, and then it was July, and then the child was walking, and then it was 1891, and she owned 40 of my acres in her own name because I put them in her name, so that no man could ever again say the word paper in my yard. We were never married. I know what was said. I know what Voss told them in Burney, and I know what got said in that church at Big Horn, and I know that when I go into a store in Sheridan there are still, in 1917, 2 or 3 old men who look at me a certain way. Let them look. She was 32 years my junior, and I was a widower with a room full of a dead boy's things, and there are 100 kinds of love in this world, and only about 4 of them have got names. She built a life. She got the school at Burney to take Ada in 1894, and when the teacher said something about the child's people, Marija went in on a Tuesday morning and came out at noon, and the teacher never said it again, and Marija never told me what she said, and I have my ideas. She learned to ride so well that Dasoda, in 1896, watching her bring a colt around, said the only sentence of praise I ever heard out of him in 19 years. He said, "She stops before he thinks she will." She rebuilt that house twice. She hated the river until 1902, and then one day she waded into it up to her knees and stood there for 10 minutes and came out and never said a word about it. And she swam in it after that every August. And I never asked and she never told. And there is a whole life in the things we agreed not to know. Desoda died in 1898 in the barn in the afternoon, sitting up against a stall with a hoof knife in his hand, and Ada found him. She was 10. He'd taught her everything. Everything he taught Merija and more, because he had more time and Ada had a way with horses that came from nowhere either of us could account for. He called her by a name in his own language that he would not translate. I asked him once and he said, "It is not a secret. It is only that it is not English," which is Desoda entire, in one sentence forever. We buried him up on the bench where you can see the willow bend. I wrote that night, clear, hot, buried Desoda, have not got a word for it. Merija read it over my shoulder. She got the habit by then, and I'd got the habit of letting her, and she said, "That is the word for it." Ada is 29 now. She has 3 children of her own and a place on the Rosebud, and she writes her mother a letter every week in Polish and me a letter every month in English, and hers are shorter, and I like them better, and I would never in 1,000 years tell either of them that. She's got Merija's chin. She's got a way of standing that takes up no room at all, and I know exactly where she got that, and it is the closest thing to a haunting I believe in. Merija is 52. There's gray at the front of her hair, and she is stronger than I am now by a good deal, and she still cannot say through and do the same way twice, and every so often, standing at the stove, she'll say cough out loud in a tone of absolute personal outrage, and I will laugh, 30 years on, every single time. The charcoal words on the wall by the stove are still there. We papered around them in 1904. Ada wouldn't let us cover them. She was 16 and she stood in front of that wall with her arms out like a fence post and said we could paper the rest. Enough through cough dough. Why? I am 79 years old. My hand shakes and the ledger has got maybe 11 pages left in it, and I have been thinking this last year about what the last entry ought to say. I've drafted it. God forgive me, I've drafted it 4 times. Man spends 53 years writing 1 line a day, he starts to want the final one to ring. But I keep coming back to a thing that happened in October, on the anniversary, though nobody in this house has ever once said the word anniversary out loud. She came in from the garden with caraway on her hands. She stood in the door and she watched me at the table with the pen, and she said, "What is the weather?" And I said, "Sleet going to snow." And she stood there, and I stood up, because I am old and it takes me a moment. And 30 years fell out from under the both of us, and there was a girl in a puddle in front of the Sheridan Depot with her boots laced in harness leather, holding onto one handle of a trunk with both hands, and I was a man who had a room nobody was using. She said, "Well." And I said, "Well." And she went and put the water on. I did not write anything that night. There was nothing to add to it. I have got the weather down, sleet, going to snow, and beneath it the line is empty and has been empty since October, and I look at it every evening, and I have come to think that I am not going to fill it in. Because the last time that page said nothing, she walked in out of the sleet and gave me the pen back. And a man is allowed 1 blank line at the end that isn't a blank line. Ada writes that they're coming for Christmas. All of them. She says her oldest has been asking about the wooden horse on the shelf in the back room, the one that looks like a dog, and would I tell him about the boy it belonged to. I have been sitting here 2 hours trying to think how I'd start. Merija says just tell him his name was Tom. She says start there and see what.